choice to me is never a completely level playing field. Some kids are never chosen.
Hi, I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies at AEI and co-author of the new book, A Search for Common Ground, Conversations about the Toughest Questions in K-12 Education. Here with my friend and co-author, Pedro Noguera, Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education. In this book, we tried to make our way through some of the thorniest issues in American education while offering a sharp, honest debate that digs deep into our principled differences. Today, we're going to talk a bit about school choice. Pedro, school choice has been on the agenda for decades now. It's been especially heated, I think, the last few years during the Trump administration. And one of the things that's striking, I think, is we're talking really, to my mind, about how much freedom should we give families, parents, and kids to choose the school that they want to attend. And I can understand how reasonable people can have reasonable disagreements about that. What's striking to me is how incredibly heated and emotional and polarizing this debate gets, and how much it has become what feels like a stand-in for larger arguments about bigger questions.
Yeah, this is one of those big controversial issues that has made education policy so polarizing. The way I look at it is affluent people always have choice. They choose what neighborhoods to live in, and therefore often that's influenced by the schools in the neighborhood, or they choose to put their kids in private schools. And across the country, what we see is in many communities, the most affluent people have their kids in private schools. Low income and middle class people have their kids in public schools. That's a problem. It's a problem because often the resources are not in those public schools. Whether or not choice addresses that, though, is, I think, a question that I haven't seen proven. I was actually a charter school authorizer when I was in New York for 3 years. And while I would say that many of the charter schools that we authorized, I was on a trustee for SUNY, the State University of New York, were outstanding. It was also clear to me that creating those schools often came at the expense of the neighborhood public schools. And by that, I mean, we would locate a brand new charter school in a building and push out the existing public school that was serving the neighborhood kids. That to me is a problem because it's exacerbating the inequities in the system.
I mean, I think, so that's interesting. There's this question about how authorizing works in charters. As you know, I've sat on the board of directors of the National Association of Charter School Authorizers for a decade or more now. And that strikes me as a very unusual practice, authorizing schools in a site where you're explicitly pushing. So I'm curious how common that is. But I think for me, one, I always like to be upfront that generally I am supportive of school choice. Not every policy, I'm not saying it always works, but I'm saying generally I tend to look favorably upon it. And it's interesting, I tend to look favorably upon it, I think not for the same reason as a lot of the people who might agree with me on the policy. We often hear school choice talked about as if it's going to raise test scores. I'm not sure it does. I don't know how choice in and of itself, choice can help lead to school improvement or not. The reason I tend to support choice is because I think we've inherited a system of schools and school districts that have taken the shape they've taken over many, many decades. And the problems they were created to solve, the arrangements they put in place, may have made a lot of sense in 1985 or 1955 or 1925. And sometimes they didn't make any sense even then. They were efforts to preserve privilege for some folks rather than others. Seems to me that choice is so powerful because it allows families and communities, and most of all, maybe educators, to have more opportunity to start from scratch, to say, here's how we might design a different model of learning. Here's how a different school might look, without having to sell it to the assistant principal, to take it to the principal, to take it to central, to take it to the soup, to get a sign off. It seems to me that there's an organic dimension to school choice, which is really about freeing people from having to operate in systems which may not be working for kids or educators.
So I agree with that, and I'll acknowledge my own privilege as a parent. When I've moved to new areas, I don't just go with whatever the local public school is. We look around and see what our options are to find the best school for my daughter. So intuitively, I feel like parents should have that right. However, as both you and I know, choice is limited by transportation. You don't have a car to get your kid to the school, then you don't really have that choice. If you don't have the information about how to compare different schools, if it's not presented in your language, or if you have a child with special needs and the schools don't really want kids like yours and they can find ways to exclude them, then you still don't have choices. So choice to me is never a completely level playing field. Some kids are never chosen. And in many cases, it's the schools that choose, not the parents. And I have a real problem with that. We have some evidence that school choice in many communities has led to increased segregation on the basis of race and class. And that to me means that it's exacerbating inequities.
So in the way you just articulated the concerns, I just find that's the right way to talk about these concerns. Like, look, choice is fine in theory, but I'm worried about transportation. I'm worried about accommodations for kids. And that's just such a healthier pushback, I think, than people who say, if you like school choice, it's because you hate public education and you want somebody to get rich, which doesn't really make a lot of sense to me anyway. So I think part of the question we've got to ask is, if we're worried that choice systems can leave some kids out or not serve them well, my concern is that that's certainly equally true of a lot of school districts. That they have demonstrated that there's whole groups of kids they don't know how to serve, or individuals who just don't map onto what districts do. And rather than saying choice always works or choice never works, it seems to me that choice is a mechanism for helping so many of these kids who feel frustrated to find a learning environment that's right for them.
Yeah, I guess the way I look at it, Rick, is choice works best when there are lots of good choices, right? If I have a kid who I know loves music and there's a school that's focused on music and I could choose to get her into that one, I'm happy as a parent. But if I can't get her in and then the only other school available is a really bad school, then that's not a choice. That's a system of producing winners and losers. And my fear is that it's not my fear. I think that that's what we've gotten into in a lot of places. There are some excellent schools that people clamor to get into. They game the system to try to get their kids in. And then there are lots of mediocre and bad schools that others get stuck with. So rather than it serving as a way to equalize opportunity, it becomes a way of rationing access to some of the better schools. And usually, let's think a little bit about who doesn't choose or who doesn't get chosen. Homeless kids, kids with special needs, kids in foster care, the undocumented. And what we know is that when too many of those kids are concentrated into one or two schools, those schools usually fail because they're overwhelmed by the needs of those kids. So those are kind of policy concerns I have. And that's why I try to distinguish between the rights of parents, which I identify with to want the best for their kids, versus what makes a system fair and equitable.
So, I mean, that was beautifully articulated. And I think one thing we got to be conscious of is the games that you're talking about always play out of traditional districts. When we buy a house, we worry about not just a good district, but who's zoned to which school. And if we've got the teacher who's not so strong in that fourth grade, you and I are going to call in and go see the principal. And if the principal doesn't, we're going to go see a school board member. And there's lots of parents who know how that's played. So it's not choice, but it's still this gaming dynamic. And for families who don't know how to play it inside the game, sometimes choice offers a way up. But your larger point's exactly right, that if we're just talking about, hey, which school do you go to? And that's one reason I think why we limit ourselves when we talk about choice just in terms of going to this school or that school. We're in the middle of the pandemic. It's become clear that some kids, not a lot, I don't think, but some kids really like learning remotely. Kids who were bullied, kids who were frustrated. That's a choice. Creating opportunity for them to learn remotely rather than going in is expanding the number of kids who are being well served in a way that works for them. Course choice, like we've seen in Louisiana, where you don't have to leave your school, but if the math program's not working for you, you can study another computer-delivered math program in your school, is a way for more kids to get what they need. So I think part of what's gone on also is it's been kind of like no choice or, school vouchers. And there's a whole bunch of murky opportunities to create solutions here that I think haven't gotten as much attention as they deserve.
Yeah, I agree with that. And so again, I don't want to suggest that I'm against giving parents the ability to choose. But another issue that I have to raise is the manipulation of choice. If you look at a lot of these schools and you just go by the website, they all sound wonderful, right? And on top of that, you have schools, many of them charters, that'll come with incentives. You go to our school, you're going to get a laptop, you're going to get a backpack, you're going to get other perks for choosing, and therefore it becomes which schools brand themselves and advertise the best have an advantage over the schools that don't or can't. And that worries me because I think we both know, advertising is all about manipulation of desire, right? And when schools get into that business, I think we start to lose something because, parents can be manipulated by the advertising.
So it's so funny when we talk in the book about how principled people can just look at this stuff through different lenses, and we're disagreeing because we're just touching the elephant in different ways. I hear you. I buy what you're saying. At the same time, part of me is okay with this. A lot of me is okay with this. I think great schools tend to be co-constructed. Parents are invested in what that school mission. They're not there grudgingly. They're there because I really want my kid in this school. And kids feel excited to go to this school each day. And if a charter school can give a kid a laptop, when charters nationally, we can argue about the data. I would point to like Pat Wolf's data at Arkansas, generally operating at about 80 cents on the dollar of their district counterparts. If they can find a way to get similar results or better results and give the kid a computer, I think that's great. And if those families are choosing that school and have bought into the brand and therefore take the school's expectations more seriously, therefore are more supportive of faculty when they need that and interacting with kids, I think that's kind of branding in a way that's good for kids and good for the mission of the school.
It could be. Except I know when I was in Detroit, where a lot of this went on, some of that branding was kind of false advertising. It sounded great on paper. Then once people got there, the education they were getting was pretty bare bones. So, I'm not for, part of what I think is wrong with the public system in many places, it's over-regulated. And I think that's the reason why the costs are high. Not that they're going into salaries, but they're going into, all kinds of compliance structures that are there to meet state and federal requirements. But I do think public schools could benefit from learning from some of the better charter schools. And we should provide public schools with the ability to be as nimble and flexible as many charter schools. And that's an opportunity I think that's been lost in this whole debate.
Absolutely. I mean, oftentimes you'll hear public school leaders saying, well, hey, if it's good for those choice schools, it should be good for us. I agree. Absolutely. If these guys want to go to their state legislature, I am happy to fly in and testify and say, yes, they need freedom to go ahead and solve problems for their kids. They need more discretion about how they use Title I funds. They need more discretion about how they devise support for IEPs so that special ed teachers aren't spending 40% of their time filling out paperwork that's required for federal compliance. I'm 100% on board. And if if district school officials are saying, hey, part of our problem is we've got lots of families with lots of very different demands. And if we could incorporate more choice into our routine, so something more like you see in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, where families have some say in the schools are going to, that it's easier to make sure families feel good about the school's approach to homework or the school's approach to dress code. Again, I'm all on board. So look, we're going to disagree about some of these policy interventions, But some of these intuitions about giving educators more flexibility, giving families more opportunities to find the school that is right for their kid, or the learning opportunity, say remote, that's right for their kid. It seems like these are things that a lot of us across the spectrum can broadly agree on, while avoiding some of the specific concerns around things like transportation and accommodations that you've pointed to, my friend.
The two of us clearly have a lot more to say on this topic, but unfortunately we're out of time. If you're interested in hearing more, please check out our new book, A Search for Common Ground, Conversations about the Toughest Questions in K-12 Education.